Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar on top 5 strategies to manage change in 2021. Today, you'll hear from change specialist Chrissy DeAngelis as she presents an overview of understanding change management. She also will introduce the ProSci ADKAR methodology and take us through a deep dive of her top 5 strategies and how best to implement them in order to drive success of organizational change. Today's session will be recorded and will be made available to you on our website afterwards. And we'll be accepting questions through the chat window of GoToWebinar. So if any questions come up, please feel free to type those directly into the chat window, and we'll leave 10 minutes at the end of our session to review questions from the audience. So without further delay, I'll pass to Chrissy to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Virginia. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this morning. As she mentioned, I'm here to talk a little bit about our change management process and my top 5 strategies for managing change. There we go. So our agenda today, I'll talk a little bit about myself. We'll go through understanding change management, the ProSci ADKAR method, and then dive right into those 5 strategies. So a little bit about me. I am a certified ProSci change practitioner. I like to say that I navigate the ambiguous world of organization and project change. I focus a lot on empathy and human-centered communications and design. I began my career in corporate communications. I also worked in the nonprofit art sector. I founded and ran a creative agency for about 6 years, and throughout all of that, I produced many thoughtful, value-based strategic communications. And I also spoke frequently on communications and design at various conferences. So let's dive into change management and talk a little bit about what it is. I love this quote. It comes from ProSci. Value does not come from change. The value comes from changes that get adopted and used. So what exactly is change management? What is it that we mean when we say that? Change management manages the people side of change, and it's the approach to driving adoption and usage so that initiatives deliver expected results and outcomes. And that can be keeping your project on budget, on schedule. There could be some other outcomes as well that you're looking for. Effective application of change management enables organizations to deliver results on each change more effectively and build competencies that grow the organization's capacity to tackle more changes at one time. So the little graphic here on your left, what I love about it is this really exemplifies a journey. You've got, all of the different pieces of change management there that you're going to see, and it really does weave. It's not a linear line to your destination. So you've got things like aligning leaders, building in communication, gathering stakeholder information, understanding the pain points and where your people are impacted, overcoming the resistance, providing organizational support and delivering value. Why is change management so important? So ProSci is based on research, and some of the things that they have found to support change management are listed right here. So I'm going to go through a couple of them. I think that they're really important in building a case for bringing a change manager on or implementing organizational change in your own organization. So ProSci shows that the amount of change across the organization is increasing significantly. And given the amount of and the frequency of the change occurring, becoming better at implementing change is essential. The majority of the changes that we see are impacting processes, addressing the cost of poorly managed change. So many organizations have examples or even a legacy of changes that were poorly managed. They didn't deliver the results that they set out to do or were intended. created enormous amounts of stress and confusion, under-delivering on change. It's not tolerable going forward. And we're seeing that even now, kind of as we're starting to adapt and overcome with COVID. Aligning organizational practice with organizational values. This case is particularly relevant for organizations that espouse the importance of value of their people. And creating consistency and efficiencies in approach. So change management practices across an organization can be more effective when there's a standard approach in place. And we'll talk a little bit about one of those approaches, the ProSci ADKAR method, in a little bit. So how and where does change management integrate with project management? So change management, along with project management and a sponsorship model, they work in tandem to ensure that your project meets its objectives. It finishes on time and on budget, and your ROI is realized. So I look at this through the lens of IT and an IT project, but a project can be anything. It could be anything from an HR related thing to something for employee communications. Really runs the gamut. We can connect change management with business results, mitigate negative consequences, and translate it to financial performance. Change management activities are woven into the project management activities throughout the duration of the project. The goal here, moving stakeholders from your current state to the future state, and then aligning the training piece, if it's needed, and oftentimes it is, with your go live. So let's kind of dive a little bit into the ProSci ADKAR method. So this is a 5-block method. It's research-based, it's structured, it's based on the common and yet overlooked reality that organizational change happens only when individuals change. It's goal-oriented, and it guides that individual change based on an appreciation of how change impacts each employee and how to support them through that change. So ADKAR is an acronym, and it represents 5 tangible, concrete outcomes that people need to achieve for long-lasting change. So you've got your A for awareness, and that's not awareness of the change, but it's awareness for the need to change. Your D is for desire, to support the change. The K is for knowledge of how to change, so having that information. The second A is for ability, and this is where the rubber really meets the road. People are demonstrating the skills that they've now have, and the behaviors that you're looking for. And then the R is for reinforcement. So this is where your change is, it has become adopted, it's sticking, and you're seeing those results. So let's talk a little bit about awareness and what awareness really means. So the goal here is an awareness of the need for the change. So again, it's not an awareness that there's a change happening. It's, oh, I understand why we're doing this, and why now. And understanding the risks of not changing. So what happens if we don't? What sorts of things build awareness? Communication, access to information, an observable condition, financial issues, organization or project failures. Those types of things would build an awareness of the need for change. When it comes down to how to do that how do you build that awareness? You're really looking at focusing on your communication methods, your communication strategy, and your communication methods. So the different vehicles. So it could be emails, meetings, all kinds of things, PowerPoint decks. What kinds of obstacles might we come up against when we're talking about building awareness? You'll see a lot of people feeling really comfortable with the status quo. There may be credibility over the source or the sender of any messages. So something to consider, making sure that you have the right person cascading that information. You could come up against folks who are just denying the reasons for the change or debating those reasons for change, and just digging their heels in, unwilling. And then rumors of misinformation. So I like this quote here at the bottom, that lack of awareness has been cited as the #1 reason for employee resistance. So just something to keep in mind as you start to go through changes in your own organization or in a project, keeping in mind that people need to be made aware. Moving on to desire. So this one can be a little bit esoteric, but we'll kind of go through some of the ways that we can help build desire in our stakeholders. The goal here is to obtain the buy-in from those stakeholders and the impacted groups, getting them excited, getting them to want to participate in the change, and actually behave in the ways that we want them to. So what builds desire? The key thing here is really answering the what's in it for me. There's an incentive there. And so taking the time to flesh out what that incentive is, writing a compelling narrative around that, and speaking to it frequently and consistently. What else can build desire? A fear of consequence, desire to belong. I mean, we see this all the time. There's a deep need for people to belong. A willingness to follow a trusted leader, and knowing that the alternative is worse. So how can we do these things to build the desire? Having an active and visible primary sponsor. So sponsor is your leader, or it could be a sponsor coalition, so several leaders who are all on the same page. They're all building excitement. They're all delivering the same message, the same key messages. The great thing about sponsorship coalition, and I'll get into this a little bit more, is that they can reach across different groups in your organization. They're really key to ensuring the success of a project. Personal engagement with coaches, proactive management of resistance, getting your employees and your stakeholders involved, and having some really strong incentive programs. What kinds of obstacles might we see when it comes to building desire? Again, the comfort and security in a current state. That's something that is, we'll see that a lot. Fear of the unknown, certainly something that we see all the time. Change not being aligned with a person's values. Someone who's not hearing or feeling like they're being heard and not having that sort of what's in it for me answered. Perhaps an organization has negative history with change. Sometimes an individual is going through something personal, and that can impact their perception of a lot of things, including their work and how they're perceiving the change. And an organization's overall history with change. These are all things to just keep in mind if you're running up against a lot of resistance and not a lot of buy-in that you really want. So moving on to knowledge. The goal with knowledge is to be knowledgeable in 2 areas. So knowledge on how to change, so what to do in that transitional period from your current to your future state, as well as knowledge on how to perform well in the future state. So this is something that I see a lot. There's a lot of anxiety sometimes that comes up in terms of what does that look like? What does the future state look like? But also, what am I supposed to do once I'm there? So what builds knowledge? Training and education, experience, access to information, lots of mentoring. How can we facilitate this? Formal training, job aids, one-on-one coaching and mentoring. I would say this is one of the big ones that I see a lot, just setting up a lot of meetings so that folks who are anxious about this, 1, feel that they're heard, and 2, feel like they've got the support. User groups and forums, and troubleshooting guidance. What kinds of obstacles might we run up against here? Gaps between current and desired skills, insufficient time, inadequate resources for training, lack of access to information, and possibly even a capacity to learn. Oops. So knowledge is that, providing the information, and ability is really, like I said before, it's where the rubber meets the road. This is where your stakeholders or your users are really starting to apply that knowledge. And the goal here is applying it and that the overall performance results are achieved. So what fosters ability? Practice. If you're talking about a new system, new piece of software, or maybe a website build, getting people in that system, getting them familiar with the interface, getting them in it like in a sandbox environment to play around, that really helps. Giving them the time to do that. Access to and being able to work with a coach. Role modeling that desired behavior, having access to the right tools, and having that feedback mechanism in place. How can we do this? How can we support our stakeholders so that they have the ability that we need them to have, to carry out this change? Again, direct involvement of coaches, access to subject matter experts. This one's super key. Just allowing them to have that one-on-one connection to somebody who really knows the material, who really knows the system, who understands what's happening. There's so much support there. It eases anxiety so much. Performance monitoring, hands-on practice during training. Again, that's a big one. And availability of expert resources to help employees. And help can look a lot of ways. Sometimes it's just, a question. Sometimes it's a little bit more hands-on. But having that, all of those sort of set up is going to be key to making sure that your stakeholders are moving through this change and applying the knowledge and doing the things that you want them to do. What kinds of obstacles might get in the way of them having the ability to perform these duties? Inadequate time to develop the skills, lack of support. There might be existing habits that are contrary to the desired behavior they're carrying over, and it's hard for people to break those habits. There could be some psychological blocks, some limitations in physical abilities, as well as individual capabilities. Again, this is also where it kind of ties back to working with a coach or working with a mentor, having somebody who's got a lot of patience, who can sit with someone and help sort out maybe some of their blocks. So our final building block here is the R, and that's for reinforcement. And the goal with reinforcement is to sustain that change over time. You want to be able to see people doing their jobs differently. What fosters reinforcement? Celebrations, rewards, recognition, feedback, corrective action if and when needed, visible performance measurement, and accountability measures. How does that look? How can we support that? Publicly visible performance scoreboards that positively show compliance, feedback, including saying thank you. It seems so simple, but it really does work. Visible recognition by senior level sponsors, project-sponsored celebrations, and compensation and appraisal systems. I'm also going to add, when we talk about accountability, I think where I've seen some success is holding folks accountable, giving them some tangible, concrete action steps or action items. It could be reporting out on their own efforts. It could be even speaking at a meeting. Again, some of these things sound simple, but when you put that ownership on someone, there's a there's some weight there, and people want to show up and do the right thing. So it is definitely, I've seen it work. What kinds of obstacles might get in the way here with reinforcement? The rewards might not resonate. They might not be meaningful enough, or they might not be associated with achievement. There could be a complete absence of any kind of reinforcement for accomplishments. Negative consequences, including peer pressure for desired behavior, or incentives that directly oppose the change. So just something to think about as you build in what the rewards might be, making sure that they're meaningful and tied to what makes sense for your employees and your stakeholders. So we have a little bit of an understanding about ADKAR now. I'm going to move us through what I have found to be the top 5 change management strategies. They all tie into ADKAR and will build on each other. So with that understanding, we can apply these 5 to our projects. And you can do this at the onset, as well as if you're finding yourself brought onto something in the middle of a project, you can still bring these ideas to the table or to your project. So we're looking at visible and active sponsorship, creating stakeholder lists and a stakeholder matrix, creating an analysis, or really deep diving, understanding, creating this analysis and summary of your current state, and then building out communication plans and a training plan. So these strategies will allow an employee or a consultant to prepare for and manage the change, follow a proven methodology. They're available to anybody on a project. They're ideally applied at the onset, but like I said, these can happen regardless of when you join a team or when you start on a project. So I talked a little bit about visible and active sponsorship earlier when I was talking about awareness and desire. But let's kind of dive into what it is and why it's so important. Most organizational changes impact multiple business groups, and they require multiple sponsors. So when you bring all these people together, you've got yourself a coalition. You've got your primary sponsor at the top, and then you've got these other folks sort of within that group there. They would represent some other departments, but they've all bought into it. They understand why this is happening, and they've signed up to help you, to help build the excitement, to lead the change, and to move it through the change until you get to this point where it's realized. They do this by conducting a series of key activities within their respective groups. Those activities could be meetings, town halls, it could be emails. There's a whole slew of things. They're far more likely to succeed when you have a strong coalition. They build the desire, they build the awareness, and they also manage resistance. A couple of other things here that are important with regards to sponsorship coalitions. They're key to engaging across the organization. A lot of times, you start out on a project and you've got your key stakeholder groups. You might find that you missed someone, you missed a group inadvertently. You need to get them on board. You need to understand how the change impacts them. That's where a great leader comes into play, because they can reach across those lines, especially if you don't have the connection there. They're great for facilitating that, introducing the project, introducing the change, and helping those groups understand why it's important for them to be engaged. Creating, coaching, and maintaining a network of active and committed change agents. So your change agent might be your main point of contact with someone in another group. And so that sponsor is really pivotal for making sure that that group understands why assigning a change agent is going to be really key. They'll communicate the importance of role modeling the change, encouraging senior leaders to participate and support the change, cultivating management support of the project, ensure alignment of expectations among other people managers. They'll clarify roles. They'll solicit and openly receive management feedback. As you start to move through your change, and you start to see where things kind of get a little bit messy, where people are resisting it, or where maybe you didn't have as much information at the onset of the project and now you do, this is where your sponsorship coalition really comes into play. They can really, really make things a lot easier for you as you start needing more groups to get involved and engage and give you feedback and help identify gaps and plan for the appropriate mitigation. So if you're a change practitioner, or you're thinking about bringing a change practitioner onto a particular project, what can this person do, particularly around, sponsorship? Take the time to get to know your project's leadership team. So this would include a manager, a senior manager, a director, or VP. Ask them how they prefer to hear about the project and how often. Establish a cadence and a status template for regular check-ins. Prepare the appropriate communication when needed. Take that time to really explain any risks you're running up against, any issues, any decisions, anything that you know that they can help you with. This is your time, to be and spend the time with them and ask for what you need. And any expectations that you need, anything that they can cascade to their reports. That's another great thing that you can do. You can provide some coaching and guidance for them if needed to facilitate any of those key activities and actions, and just identifying the best ways that leadership can support the project. A lot of times this just happens through conversation. You're talking about a risk or an issue and it comes up in conversation, the kinds of behavior that you're really desiring. And that's where your leadership can help ensure that people are aligning and they're doing the things that they need to do. So moving into your stakeholder list and matrix, once you have your sponsorship and your key project team identified, you're going to want to move into really creating this the stakeholder list and then understanding how all of these different stakeholders are impacted. So this list is it's a master list of all your stakeholders and who are impacted by your group, or I'm sorry, impacted by your project, organized by role and department. The matrix piece of it will break down the what's in it for me by group and each group's preferred methods of communications and their preferred senders. So this list will act as a direct input primarily to your communication activities, but it also, starting here is a great place to start because it's an input to your current state analysis. It'll also act as an input to your training analysis. So, we got to start with who's impacted and how and where they are, how we can meet them where they are, and the best way to do that. So what can a change practitioner do? You want to work with your project manager to identify the various project and business stakeholders. I think the other piece here is really kind of taking a step back and looking at this through the lens of what don't I know? There's always what you do know, but then who else might I be forgetting? Being able to ask that question, I think, gets us at least out of our own way to be able to see if there's anyone else who may be on the fringe, and starting to ask those types of questions to different groups as well as our leadership. So start with, the folks who are assigned to the project first. They're the people that your leadership, your business SMEs, who are subject matter experts, and their managers, and then consider who else may be impacted. I like to create just a simple table in Excel with names, departments, and managers, and I'll show you an example of that in the next slide. You will want to revisit this list, ideally quarterly or after each phase. So in addition to being a repository of all those involved in the project, it is that matrix that guides your what's in it for me messaging. So again, just a simple Excel spreadsheet. It does not need to be anything super fancy, but just it gets the information out there. It's organized by the different teams. You've got, the name, department, project role, manager, email, and any additional information that might be pertinent. So what I've done here is this is your matrix, and what I typically do is, one tab is the list, the second tab is this matrix. This is to understand what those stakeholders need to do and know, and like I said, it'll inform your communications. So you've got your group, you might have your leader name, some information about how the project affects the group, their level of impact. What do these people need to know? What do these people need to do? The criticality of the project's success to that group, any concerns, any benefits that you know right now, and any resistance mitigation that you're planning. So I'm going to move us into the analysis of a current state. So what is it and why is it so important? So this analysis, it's actually going to be a series of different things, but ultimately you're presenting a report. It offers insight into how the situation looks right now. It includes assessment of your company and the team's culture and values. You've got your stakeholder list that you've already done, the impacts by group that you've begun understanding and figuring out because of your stakeholder analysis. Various surveys or interviews if you find that they're needed, and any assessments. We'll talk a little bit about the ProSci risk assessment in a moment, and any past lessons. You will hear me say a lot during this presentation. I'll bring up lessons learned quite a bit. There's always lessons to be learned and applied as we move through different projects. So altogether, these will paint a picture of what your current state looks like and any risks as you start to head into the project and moving people through the change. It's a starting point to begin conversations about the future state, where the impacts and the gaps are, and how the transition will look. The analysis will also provide a roadmap for communication, coaching, training, and mitigation. Because you're setting yourself up to know this is where we are, you can then say this is how we're going to get to the future state. There may be a change management strategy that focuses more heavily on training, maybe more heavily on communications, maybe both, because of what you're learning in your current state. And it touches on all aspects of that CAR. So what kinds of things can change practitioners do? It'll be informed by a few inputs. So you want to create or ask for the following. Any organizational change readiness interviews. These types of interviews ask people sort of what they know about the project so far, if they know anything. So it's a good starting point to gauge where folks are. Any impact or risk assessments, your project change, leadership strengths and weaknesses, and any past lessons and learnings. So this is the ProSci risk assessment. This is one of the first things, the first sort of activities, change management activities that we do on a project. It's an exercise that's in Excel. They lead you through a series of questions. Like these are just a few samples of the questions. And you would rank so where things fall based on what you know about your project right now. And again, like a lot of the things that happen in change management, these are things that you might need to come back to and redo, perhaps as your project enters a new phase or every 6 months, because things change and things evolve. And as you rank them, what happens is ProSci's algorithm will spit out a what they consider to be this is where your project is. It's high risk, it's medium risk, it's low risk, based on these change characteristics and your organizational attributes. The scope of the change, how many people are impacted, the type of the change, is it simple, is it really complex? what were the impacts of past changes. So knowing a lot of this information going into this assessment is going to be helpful. I've done it with project managers and senior leaders, so it's not just me ranking this. I bring in some other knowledgeable folks, and together we'll work through this. It's also helpful if you have a business lead. They have a different perspective as well. So, depending on where your project falls, if you've got a high-risk project, there could be a number of change management activities in addition to the ones that I'm talking about here that you may need to do. If it's a lower risk, doing these 5 may be just enough to move everybody through the change. But it's helpful to know, it's helpful to have this algorithm, it's helpful to understand sort of why you're getting a low score, why you're getting a high score. The importance of the lessons and improvements. So if this project spans across several businesses or several groups, which we've learned, this typically happens, ask another business or department who went through something similar, deployment or implementation. Just hearing their experience and their observations and being able to document that is something that you can then kind of go back to over the course of your own project and learn from other people's mistakes, learn from other people's successes as well. If you're working with a vendor, being able to ask other business units or, even doing your own due diligence with the vendor's past clients, what was the experience like with that vendor, documenting those lessons. And a lot of this may come by way of just informal conversations, but then documenting that so you've got an artifact. And then taking the time to review and consider themes and lessons and how they can be applied to your project. Right, so moving us into the communication plan, and then we'll talk a little about training. What is it? Why is it so important? This communication plan helps immensely in planning out the various communications to include what they'll be, the frequency and consistency, who will send what and to whom and when. And then the follow-up to the plan is just kind of working backwards and putting all of those communication methods and the timing into a calendar for scheduling. And you could do that in Microsoft Outlook. You could do it in Teams. If you're on Google, you could do it, in Google Calendar. What can change practitioners do? Your plan's going to be informed by your stakeholder list, that matrix that we talked about, the change story, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then again, your past lessons and learnings. Any kind of communication mistakes that you may have heard of, or, that oral tradition that lives, you will absolutely hear about the things that didn't work. So jotting those down and planning mitigation around that will certainly help you. Understanding who's impacted and how, the preferred communication methods and the preferred senders, and then looking at those past lessons. So key component of your communication plan is going to be building out your change story. So this is a narrative, and it's a very emotional and storytelling piece that the great thing about the change story is that if you build it out in a deck, you've got slides that can then be used time and time again to supplement all kinds of communications. You might pull them into a leadership meeting, you might pull them into a newsletter, you could be pulling out different bullet points, you can be sending them up the chain to leadership and saying, you might want to mention these 3 things, or sending it kind of out peer-wise and asking folks to cascade. So the use for this it's far and wide. This certainly ties back into the awareness piece, but it also really ties into the desire piece, because your big piece of the change story is answering the what's in it for me. It breaks down those impacts and benefits by stakeholder. So you're really taking the time to think outside of the whole feature piece, but really, what is it that makes your solution so great? This is the moment where you're talking about saving people time, you're talking about their pain points, things of that nature. How to do that? You just want to be able to spend some time with your project manager and your leadership to get some of those answers. And for me, I have found that, I might be asking why quite a bit, but the more that you ask why, the easier it is to get to the core benefit, the thing that's really going to build that desire. What is it that you're really selling, right? Saving somebody time, saving somebody money, that sort of thing. So again, like the stakeholder matrix and stakeholder list, my sample communication plan, it's just something simple. It's in Excel. The purpose here is to identify and document those different communication channels, the purpose of each one, its objective, the target audience, the frequency that we're going to send it, who's owning it, any key messages, etc. So there might be calendar invitations, there might be artifacts like your change story, there could be something like a newsletter. We use Sway because it's a Microsoft supported product, leadership emails. There's so many, and it's going to differ for every organization and every team. And this is one of those reasons why having those interviews and those meetings with your impacted groups early on, engaging them, I always like to ask, what's normal? What do you guys, what types of communication methods do people within your group respond to? Are they more likely to open an email versus a link? Are they more likely to open it because it came from so-and-so versus me? So getting answers to those types of questions informs this piece. And it sets you up to be successful as well. It also builds an enormous amount of trust because people see that you care. So transitioning from communication to training, what is it and why is it so important? Your training plan will guide your knowledge efforts. It's going to include the purpose for the project. It's going to include the training approach. You're going to look at high-level content, the timeline of your training, and any expectations around training. The analysis piece is really a working document that you've kept for the duration of the project. A lot of this you're going to hear from the get-go. When you start talking to your stakeholders and you're doing your current state analysis, you will start to hear where folks' anxiety is around knowledge and ability, where they don't know certain things and where they do, and where those gaps are. And the idea here is to begin just logging that information, documenting it so that you can track it and watch it and plan for the training. So what can you do as a change practitioner? Your training should be aligned with Go Live. If a vendor is creating your training and delivering that, creating a plan is still helpful. It's going to be extremely helpful for your employees or your project SMEs. What I like to do is to just create a client branded document. I weave in the vendor's documentation and I present it to our project team and our SMEs to review, to give us some input and some feedback. Again, constant feedback loop here, making sure that we're watching and planning for any gaps in knowledge and training. What can change practitioners do? So your training plan will be informed from a couple of things: your stakeholder list, your current state analysis, your training analysis that you've been working on throughout the duration of your project, any vendor documentation that you might have, and again, your past lessons and learnings, and then the project scope. Your project scope is helpful because it also tells you who was laid out from the beginning to deliver what and when. So review that scope with your project manager. Review those past lessons, learnings. Review that training analysis and your stakeholder list and matrix. Again, understanding who's impacted and how. any additional knowledge and process gaps that are identified, the type of training that each group will need, and consider the best approach for the training. So not everything, it doesn't always make sense to have a big, big, huge training. I know once upon a time we all used to gather in groups in a room, and maybe someday we'll get back to that, but what is the best approach? It may be something as simple as a job aid. Your business folks will tell you what makes the most sense. Other things might be a webinar or a lecture demonstration. It could also be working directly with a vendor SME to document a process. So having that conversation, I've learned just not to assume that we know what the best type of training is or will make sense, to let the business kind of guide us in that area. Building out the training plan, incorporating any vendor training syllabi into that plan. If I am, or if your team is creating or delivering that training, make sure to allocate the time and the resources for the material development. That can definitely take a lot of time, and you want to make sure that you've got the right people to do that. There's sort of the skill set of translating, and then there's also the skill set of writing. So it might be one and the same person, but sometimes it's two or three. Reviewing that plan with your team and your stakeholders, again, that constant feedback loop. And then creating surveys, because after you deliver the training, you want to know how it went. Sometimes we've done surveys ahead of time. Again, like those current state analysis surveys might help here. Any kind of like business readiness survey is helpful throughout the project, but maybe one right before they go into training, during the training, and then right after, just to kind of gauge and get that feedback. And I've also kind of cornered people and said, you can tell me how this went. Sometimes getting people on the spot in person, you get a really honest answer about how something went. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I know we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. I also wanted to make sure that I brought up this last slide for any of you that might need to reach out to Hellenic for questions. So I'll turn it over to Elena.
Hi, yes, we do have a couple of questions that we have a bit of time at the end here to go through. And thank you for presenting that, Chrissy. That was great information. So we wanted to know, do you have to go through these steps and do all of these templates sequentially, or does that not matter so much?
I go through all of these steps on every single project, even the smaller, less complex projects. What I put together here are the 5 that I would say anybody everywhere should be using, regardless of how complex your project is. In terms of going through it sequentially, yes, that's my recommendation. I find that starting with that stakeholder list really is the place to start. However, what I also realize is that there's a lot of things that happen at the same time, that happen in parallel. So I'll be starting that stakeholder analysis as I'm starting the current state. And I'm thinking about the communication. And as soon as I get maybe 25% through the current state, I'm building out the communication plan. So there is an order to it, but there's a lot of overlap. And there's also a lot of kind of doubling back. Even though ADKAR moves folks through in an order, you need to have the awareness before you can have the desire, before you can have the knowledge. What I find is, change is messy. We're talking about people and personalities and complexities and things that we know and things that we don't know. So staying really open to that ambiguity and knowing that, somebody could kind of be moving through and be at the knowledge part and then suddenly kind of shut down. And we've got to double back, and doubling back to the awareness, reminding them. So there can be some repeats of conversations and of activities, but it does always sort of flow this in the sequential way.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that makes sense. And then Also, another question, can you tell us about a time on a project when things went awry from a change management perspective, and how did you steer it back on track?
Sure. So I was on a pretty complex project. It was complex, and it was also, there were a lot of stakeholders involved. It was also highly visible, meaning that leadership had its eyeballs on this project. Its success was important. What we realized when I came on the project, myself and some other team members, we kind of came in the middle. A lot of the requirements had been gathered, and a lot of business folks had already been assigned to the project. And then, something else you'll see is that a lot of people roll off too. If you're on a project for even 9 months, people come and go. And with that goes a lot of institutional knowledge. And so kind of coming on, we thought we had our key stakeholder groups, and even asking questions early on, we still thought we had everybody present and accounted for. It wasn't until we got to some of the training that we had built in throughout the project that we realized that, oh, you know what? This piece of the application this really impacts this other group. And so we needed to kind of double back, go back to that other group and say, we need you back in this project. And there were some challenges there because, they had been involved early on, but they no longer were. Their own department had sort of gone through some restructuring. They were no longer assigned to the project. So that's a key moment where we needed leadership to help facilitate those conversations. Once we re-engaged those folks, we met a lot of resistance. There were a lot of old mindsets and, I think understanding of the change, but not necessarily understanding the need for the change and why. And so we had to, again, goes back to the sequential order, but I might have been further down the pike with another group, but I had to kind of double all the way back to the beginning with this group that we had to re-engage. We also found with them that, the training that we had planned, it was a good baseline, but it wasn't enough. And we had to go back many, many times and rework the training plan to make sure that they got what they needed. And, a lot of that was us asking them the right questions, digging deep, what is it that you really need? How can we help support that? We found that, with certain groups, they were fine being in a room listening to somebody present a lecture demonstration, but with this other group, they needed one-on-one with our vendor. They needed to be able to write out, document their own processes because their process had changed so much. So they required a lot, it was a lot of handholding and a lot of attention, but you do what you have to do. It was a lot of doubling back, moving them through, that entire ADKAR building block methodology there. So did it go awry? I think it felt like it went awry in the beginning because we didn't know, but we got it back on track. It just took an enormous amount of patience and an understanding and empathy, empathizing with people that they didn't know, they had no idea. And how would I feel if, somebody came up to me and said, by the way, this is going to impact you, and now we need you to, drop what you're doing and come work on this project. And so always kind of holding space for that piece of it and having patience with people to work through
it. Okay, well, thank you. And if there are no other questions from the group, we can go ahead and wrap up. Let me just check one more time. Okay, so thank you all again for attending this morning's webinar. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the session will be made available to you on the Olenic website. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to your Olenic account manager for follow-up. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chrissy.